Every journey begins with a choice, but some choices lead into the dark. November 1872. New York Harbor is thick with cold smoke and freezing mist. The Mary Celeste is ready. Her hold is heavy. Her crew is prepared. They think they are heading for Italy. They have no idea they are sailing into a void. If you are listening to my stories right now, I wonder, where in the world are you joining me from? Perhaps in the quiet of the night or amidst the rush of the day. Wherever you are welcome here. But before we step further into the shadows of this enigma, if you are a soul drawn to the whispers of the past and the mysteries the world forgot, you have found your sanctuary. Join our growing circle of seekers by subscribing to Dreamy Old Stories. Together, let us journey into the depths of history where the truth remains hidden and every story carries a secret. Welcome back. This is Dreamy Old Stories, and today we uncover a tale that was never meant to be told. Late autumn settled heavily over New York Harbor as the Mary Celeste prepared to leave the crowded waterfront behind. The sky carried a pale gray color that blended gradually into distant smoke drifting above warehouses, chimneys, and ship masts gathered along the docks. Thick ropes stretched between wooden piers and dark hulls stained by salt water and years of Atlantic travel. Barrels waited in uneven rows beside cargo cranes, while workers crossed damp planks carrying crates toward the open hold of the brigantine. Gulls circled constantly above the harbor, gliding through cold wind rising from the water below. Nearby ships rocked gently against their moorings as tide currents pushed floating debris and broken pieces of wood through narrow spaces between the piers. The harbor air carried layers of sensation that settled deeply into clothing, skin, and breath. Coal smoke drifted low above the docks and merged with the sharp smell of seawater, wet rope, tar, and fish unloaded earlier that morning from nearby boats. Sailors moving across the deck spoke through bursts of wind that carried fragments of conversation away before words fully reached the shore. Cold mist clung to coats and gathered along railings dampened by spray from the harbor tide. Somewhere farther down the waterfront, iron chains rattled loudly as another cargo vessel prepared for departure beneath the cries of gulls circling overhead. Inside the Mary Celeste, lanterns glowed faintly below deck where stored provisions, folded blankets, and packed belongings waited within narrow wooden rooms already touched by the approaching Atlantic cold. As the tide shifted, activity aboard the brigantine slowly gathered purpose and direction. Crew members loosened mooring lines while others climbed carefully into the rigging to adjust sails, responding unevenly to the harbor wind. Workers along the dock completed the final loading of cargo barrels intended for distant markets across the Atlantic. Small boats crossed nearby waters carrying passengers, supplies, and messages between crowded sections of the harbor before afternoon light began fading behind clouds. Gradually, the space between the Mary Celeste and the pier widened. Water moved softly against the hull as the brigantine eased outward into the busy harbor traffic surrounding New York. Shoreline buildings drifted slowly past, while bells rang faintly from somewhere beyond the waterfront through fog, smoke, and cold November air. For those aboard the departing vessel, the moment likely carried a quiet mixture of routine and separation familiar to maritime life. Sailors had experienced departures before, yet leaving land behind always altered the mind in subtle ways difficult to explain. The harbor represented warmth, crowded streets, human voices, and the stable presence of solid ground beneath one's feet. Beyond the outer edge of New York waited only sea, weather, and long uncertain distance stretching toward foreign shores. Captain Briggs probably watched the receding waterfront with practical concentration, shaped by responsibility rather than sentiment. Sarah and their daughter may have observed the disappearing city differently, noticing windows fading into mist or gulls following briefly beside the ship. Slowly, the familiar outline of land softened beneath gray Atlantic haze as the brigantine turned toward open water. As the Mary Celeste moved farther through the harbor channels, the crowded rhythm of New York slowly unfolded around the brigantine in widening layers. Steam ferries crossed nearby waters carrying passengers wrapped in dark coats against the late autumn cold. Tugboats released clouds of black smoke that drifted low across the surface of the harbor before dissolving into mist. Along distant piers, workers continued unloading cargo from ships arriving after long Atlantic crossings while others shouted instructions beside stacks of timber, coal, and imported goods waiting beneath canvas coverings. The brigantine traveled steadily between this activity with measured patience, its sails gathering uneven gusts of harbor wind as smaller boats shifted aside to clear passage. Above the moving water, gulls continued circling the vessel as though reluctant to leave the familiar shoreline behind. Life aboard the departing ship carried its own enclosed atmosphere separate from the busy harbor surrounding it. The deck breathed strongly of damp canvas, wet wood, rope fiber, and cold seawater striking against the hull below. Sailors pulled at lines roughened by salt and previous voyages, while leather boots scraped across planks darkened by spray and mist. From below deck came faint traces of stored cargo mixed with lamp oil and preserved food secured for the crossing ahead. The Atlantic air grew colder as the brigantine moved away from the crowded waterfront and into more open water where wind traveled with greater force across the harbor. Crew members tightened coats around their shoulders while speaking briefly between tasks. Somewhere above, loose rigging tapped sharply against the mast whenever sudden gusts passed through the rising sails. Gradually, the physical relationship between ship and city began changing. The harbor widened while the buildings of New York softened into distant shapes beneath drifting gray fog. Church towers, warehouse roofs, and factory chimneys appeared less distinct with each passing hour. The brigantine rolled more noticeably now as it encountered broader currents near the outer harbor where river water blended into the Atlantic tide. Sailors adjusted sails repeatedly to match changing wind conditions, while Captain Briggs studied weather and direction from the quarterdeck with practiced attention. Sarah remained below deck part of the afternoon, organizing belongings unsettled by the ship's stronger movement, though she occasionally stepped outside briefly with her daughter to observe the receding shoreline disappearing slowly behind smoke, mist, and cold afternoon light spreading across the water. For everyone aboard, departure created a gradual emotional transition rather than a sudden break from land. Familiar sounds from the harbor faded slowly into distance until only wind, waves, and shipboard activity remained close at hand. The routines of maritime travel began returning naturally as sailors focused more fully on sails, navigation, and weather conditions shaping the voyage ahead. Even conversation changed subtly once the city drifted beyond clear sight. Voices lowered. Attention turned outward toward sea and sky rather than toward the busy life of the docks left behind. The brigantine carried its passengers farther into Atlantic space with each movement of tide and wind, drawing them quietly away from crowded streets and human certainty toward the immense gray openness waiting beyond the harbor mouth. By late afternoon, the Mary Celeste had reached waters where the protective shape of the harbor no longer softened the movement of the Atlantic beneath the hull. The sea lifted the brigantine with broader rolling motion that caused barrels below deck to shift faintly against their restraints. Waves carried darker color here beyond the harbor entrance, reflecting the heavy sky above in long, uneven bands of gray and muted silver. Far behind the vessel, New York appeared reduced to a distant line interrupted by fading towers, smoke, and low November cloud. The sails stretched more fully now as stronger winds arrived from open water, pulling the brigantine steadily eastward while cold mist traveled low across the surface of the sea around the ship. The sensory world aboard the vessel deepened as land receded farther into distance. Salt air grew sharper and cleaner away from the crowded harbor, carrying fewer traces of coal smoke and city industry. The wind pressed more heavily against coats and exposed skin while moisture gathered across ropes, railings, and the captain's beard. The ship itself responded constantly to the Atlantic movement beneath it. Timber groaned softly along the hull. Rigging strained overhead with low rhythmic sounds shaped by shifting gusts. Lanterns below deck swayed gently from their hooks even before evening approached. Meals prepared in the galley carried the comforting scent of warm bread and boiled coffee into passageways already cooling with the arrival of open sea air. Each sensation reminded those aboard that the harbor world now belonged firmly and irretrievably behind them. As evening approached, subtle changes unfolded across the brigantine with quiet regularity. Crew members secured loose equipment before darkness fully arrived and checked cargo restraints below deck as the ship encountered stronger swells. Captain Briggs reviewed navigation conditions while exchanging brief instructions with sailors moving carefully through the growing wind across the deck. Sarah wrapped additional blankets around her daughter after the colder Atlantic air entered the family cabin through narrow seams beside the windows. Gulls that had followed the vessel since departure gradually disappeared one by one, turning back toward the unseen shoreline behind them. Even the color of the sea shifted with the fading daylight. Gray water darkened toward deep blue and black, while the horizon dissolved slowly into gathering evening mist spread across the Atlantic. The emotional atmosphere aboard the Mary Celeste likely changed during these first hours beyond sight of land. Departure from harbor carried practical demands that kept minds occupied, yet the wider ocean encouraged quieter reflection once routine settled over the ship. For sailors, the familiar rhythm of maritime life returned through work, weather, and repeated movement beneath their feet. For the Briggs family, the voyage may have felt more intimate now that the distractions of the harbor had vanished into distance. The brigantine became their entire physical world, surrounded by water extending endlessly in every direction. Above them, clouds moved slowly across the dimming sky, while the Atlantic opened farther outward beneath the approaching night, carrying the vessel gently into deeper isolation beyond the fading memory of shore. Night arrived gradually over the Atlantic after the last faint outline of land disappeared behind mist and distance. The Mary Celeste traveled onward beneath a sky layered with drifting clouds that occasionally opened to reveal scattered stars above the dark water. Lanterns hanging along the deck cast small, moving circles of light across damp planks and tightly coiled rope. The brigantine rose and settled steadily against the swells, its masts leaning gently whenever stronger gusts crossed the sails from the northeast. Far from the crowded harbor, the sea carried a deeper sense of openness difficult to measure by sight alone. Nothing interrupted the horizon now except darkness, weather, and the slow, breathing movement of Atlantic water surrounding the vessel from every direction. The sounds aboard the ship became more noticeable once the noise of New York faded completely behind them. Waves struck the hull with hollow force beneath the family cabin, while rigging overhead produced irregular notes shaped by shifting wind. Sailors crossing the deck during evening watch moved carefully through dim lantern light, their boots scraping softly against wet timber polished by years of sea travel. The smell of salt water grew stronger during the colder nighttime hours, mixing with lamp smoke drifting upward through narrow vents from below deck. Inside the galley, lingering warmth from the evening meal remained trapped within the wooden walls, carrying traces of coffee, cooked grain, and damp while drying near the stove. Beyond the brigantine, the Atlantic night carried only wind, black water, and scattered mist drifting low across the surface of the sea. As the voyage settled into its first full night beyond the American coast, routines of long-distance travel resumed naturally among the crew. Watches changed according to the ship's schedule, while sailors adjusted sails responding to changing wind conditions that arrived unevenly through the darkness. Captain Briggs remained awake later than many others, studying compass readings and weather patterns beneath lantern light near the quarterdeck. Sarah prepared the cabin carefully for the colder night ahead, securing loose belongings and helping her daughter settle into sleep despite the unfamiliar motion of the brigantine beneath the bed. Small details shifted constantly aboard the vessel. A lantern chain tapped softly against the ceiling beam. Water slipped across sections of deck during stronger swells. Wind tightened certain ropes while leaving others hanging loose and quiet beside the mast. For those aboard the Mary Celeste, the first night at sea likely carried a private emotional transition difficult to separate from the surrounding darkness. Land had fully disappeared now, taking with it the reassuring presence of cities, roads, and ordinary human life. The brigantine floated alone within an immense natural world shaped by tide, weather, and distance beyond human control. Yet maritime families often accepted such isolation with calm familiarity developed through repeated voyages across the Atlantic. The ship itself became a form of shelter, moving carefully through uncertainty. Lantern light, warm blankets, shared conversation, and practiced routine offered comfort against the vast cold sea outside the cabin walls. Beneath the drifting clouds of the November sky, the Mary Celeste continued eastward, carrying its quiet household deeper into Atlantic darkness and approaching history. The following morning arrived slowly through layers of pale fog, drifting across the Atlantic around the Mary Celeste. Dawn light spread weakly over the water, revealing long swells rolling beneath the brigantine with patient rhythm left behind by distant weather farther out at sea. Moisture covered nearly every surface aboard the vessel. Thin droplets gathered along railings, ropes, and sailcloth while the deck carried the dark sheen of seawater pushed upward during the night. Crew members emerged quietly into the cold morning air wrapped in heavy coats stiffened by salt and dampness. Above them, the sails shifted lazily against changing wind while the brigantine moved onward through gray water that blended softly into the fog-hidden horizon surrounding the ship from every direction. Morning activity aboard the vessel unfolded through familiar sensory patterns shaped by maritime routine. Coffee boiled in the galley and carried warmth into narrow passageways where cold air still lingered from the night. Sailors handled wet ropes with reddened hands while gulls, now far fewer than before, appeared briefly through the fog before dissolving again into the pale distance. The Atlantic smelled cleaner here beyond the influence of harbor smoke and crowded city docks. Salt water, damp timber, canvas, and fresh wind forming the entire atmosphere surrounding the brigantine. Inside the family cabin, Sarah brushed moisture from the small windows while their daughter watched the shifting fog with quiet curiosity. Somewhere overhead, footsteps crossed the deck steadily as sailors adjusted lines and checked the condition of sails darkened by mist and seawater. Throughout the day, The weather changed in subtle, uneven ways common to late autumn crossings. Fog thickened during certain hours until nearby waves appeared suddenly from whiteness beside the hull before slipping away again behind drifting mist. Later, brief openings in the clouds allowed weak sunlight to touch sections of the deck and warm the cabin walls for short periods before grayness returned. Captain Briggs remained attentive to these changes, consulting instruments and scanning the sea carefully from the quarterdeck, while the crew continued ordinary duties around him. Below deck, cargo barrels shifted faintly whenever larger swells passed beneath the brigantine. Sarah reorganized stored belongings unsettled during the previous night, while their daughter occupied herself with books, small toys, and cautious exploration of familiar corners within the confined shipboard world. The emotional atmosphere aboard the Mary Celeste deepened quietly as the voyage carried everyone farther from the certainty of land. Time at sea moved differently from life ashore. Hours were shaped more by weather, watches, meals, and changing light than by clocks or crowded schedules. The brigantine became a small, enclosed world surrounded entirely by Atlantic emptiness hidden behind fog and distance. For the crew, this isolation likely felt familiar, even comforting through repetition and discipline. For Sarah and her daughter, the experience may have carried moments of wonder mixed with quiet confinement beneath the low gray sky. Yet the ship itself offered continuity through routine movement, warm lantern light, shared meals, and the constant presence of human voices within the endless surrounding sea. As the Mary Celeste continued deeper into the Atlantic crossing, the routines established during departure began settling into quieter permanence aboard the vessel. The excitement and distraction of leaving New York had faded behind them, replaced now by the measured rhythm of maritime travel shaped by weather, labor, and long distance. Each morning brought fresh observations of sea and sky rather than crowded docks or passing harbor traffic. The brigantine moved steadily through shifting conditions beneath broad stretches of pale cloud and occasional bursts of weak sunlight reflected across restless water. Its hull carried the familiar sounds of an aging merchant ship at sea. Timber creaking beneath pressure from the swells, loose fittings tapping softly during rougher movement, sails pulling against the wind with low breathing force that traveled throughout the vessel. Life aboard the ship became increasingly physical in small, unnoticed ways. Clothing remained cool and slightly damp from the Atlantic air, no matter how carefully it was dried near the galley stove. Salt gathered along coat sleeves, beard hair, and boots exposed repeatedly to spray drifting across the deck. Meals carried deeper importance at sea where warmth and routine offered emotional comfort against the surrounding cold. Coffee, bread, preserved meat, and hot stew filled the narrow shipboard rooms with familiar scent while waves rolled beneath the floorboards. Even ordinary tasks required awareness of movement. Writing letters demanded steady hands during rough water. Carrying lanterns through passageways meant adjusting balance with each shift of the brigantine beneath one's feet. The Atlantic shaped every detail of daily existence through constant physical presence surrounding the vessel. Small changes continued unfolding naturally as the voyage progressed eastward. The crew adjusted sail positions according to shifting winds arriving from colder northern waters. Captain Briggs reviewed charts and instruments regularly while observing weather patterns gathering across the horizon. Sarah adapted her household routines to the motion of the sea more confidently with each passing day, securing belongings before rough weather and preparing the cabin for colder evenings as autumn deepened around them. Their daughter grew familiar with the brigantine's confined spaces and changing sounds, no longer startled by creaking timber or lanterns swaying gently overhead during the night. Even conversations aboard seemed quieter now, shaped by the growing distance separating the ship from ordinary human life ashore. The brigantine carried everyone farther into Atlantic solitude beneath increasingly empty skies and colder winds. Yet despite the isolation surrounding them, the Mary Celeste remained filled with ordinary human presence during those early days at sea. Crewmen worked methodically among sails, ropes, and cargo without awareness of the future mystery history would later attach to their voyage. Sarah folded blankets, wrote notes, and cared for her daughter within the narrow warmth of the family cabin. Captain Briggs balanced practical responsibility with quiet domestic life carried aboard the brigantine beside him. Around them stretched only ocean and weather moving endlessly beneath the gray autumn sky. The ship traveled onward through fog, wind, and rolling Atlantic swells much as countless merchant vessels had done before. At that moment, nothing aboard suggested disappearance or legend. The Mary Celeste remained simply a working brigantine crossing cold water toward distant shores hidden somewhere beyond the horizon. The shores of America are gone. The cold Atlantic has taken them in. Inside this wooden shell, life moves with a fragile rhythm. But as the ocean grows deeper, the isolation begins to warp reality. What happens when the routine becomes a cage? The Mary Celeste carried the appearance of a small wooden settlement drifting across open water beneath the gray Atlantic sky. Its narrow passageways, low cabin ceilings, and damp timber walls enclosed every aspect of daily existence within a confined, moving structure shaped constantly by sea and weather. Barrels rested tightly secured below deck beside crates, tools, folded canvas, and preserved supplies packed carefully for the long crossing ahead. Boots left dark marks across planks polished by salt and years of use. Lantern hooks swung gently from ceiling beams, while ropes coiled neatly near the rail waited for the next adjustment of sail or rigging. Outside the hull, endless water rose and settled against the brigantine in slow, heavy motion that never fully stopped beneath the vessel. The sensory atmosphere aboard the ship surrounded everyone continuously from morning until night. Meals prepared in the galley filled narrow corridors with the scent of boiled coffee, salted meat, onions, and warm bread heated above the small iron stove. Damp wool clothing hung near cabin walls where traces of seawater and smoke gathered deeply into fabric over time. Lanterns released soft, oily warmth after sunset, while wind carried colder Atlantic air through cracks along doors and windows. Above deck, sailors heard gulls only occasionally now as the voyage pushed farther from land. More often the dominant sounds became creaking timber, shifting cargo below, and waves striking the hull with hollow force beneath the sleeping quarters. Even silence aboard the brigantine carried texture shaped by weather, movement, and confined human presence. Daily routines aboard the Mary Celeste unfolded through repeated actions that gradually shaped the rhythm of life at sea. Sailors rose before daylight for morning watch, while others descended below deck after long nighttime hours spent among cold wind and darkness. Coffee boiled early each morning as crew members adjusted sails according to shifting weather conditions surrounding the brigantine. Sarah Briggs organized domestic tasks within the small family cabin, securing belongings before rougher swells unsettled shelves and furniture. Captain Briggs moved steadily between navigation duties, cargo inspections, and conversations with crewmen handling repairs or maintenance across the deck. Throughout the day, the ship responded constantly to changing Atlantic conditions, sails tightening suddenly beneath stronger gusts, lanterns swaying more sharply, footsteps adjusting instinctively to the uneven motion beneath the wooden floors. For those living aboard the Brigantine, the ship gradually became more than transportation crossing the Atlantic. It formed an enclosed emotional world where familiar habits gained unusual importance through repetition and closeness. Shared meals, short conversations, and routine tasks helped structure time within an environment surrounded entirely by water and uncertain weather. Sailors learned each other's movements and moods through long exposure inside cramped spaces where privacy remained limited. The Briggs family carried domestic warmth into the harsher atmosphere of maritime labor, softening sections of the vessel through ordinary gestures and household order. Beyond the outer walls of timber and rope stretched an immense ocean indifferent to human routine. Yet inside the moving wooden world of the Mary Celeste, life continued through discipline, companionship, and the quiet persistence of daily habit. Morning aboard the Mary Celeste often began before sunrise while the Atlantic remained dark beneath low drifting clouds. Sailors moved carefully across the deck, carrying lanterns whose dim light trembled against wet planks and coils of rope darkened by seawater. The Brigantine rolled steadily through the swells, causing doors to creak softly within their frames and loose chains to tap against nearby beams. Below deck, narrow sleeping quarters slowly filled with movement as crewmen pulled on damp boots and thick wool coats, chilled by the night air. Captain Briggs usually appeared above deck early, studying wind direction and weather conditions while the eastern horizon gradually brightened into pale gray light, spreading across the open sea surrounding the ship. The sensory world during these early hours carried a heavy mixture of cold, moisture, and familiar shipboard routine. Steam rose from cups of coffee held between roughened hands while the smell of hot grain, smoke, and salted meat drifted outward from the galley. The Atlantic air pressed sharply against exposed skin and carried traces of rope fiber, wet timber, and sea spray through every section of the vessel. Sailors handling rigging felt moisture collecting instantly along gloves and sleeves as the wind strengthened after dawn. Somewhere below deck, water shifted faintly against the hull in rhythmic patterns that blended with footsteps overhead and the constant groaning of old timber responding to pressure from the sea. Even breathing aboard the Brigantine seemed shaped by the cold Atlantic atmosphere surrounding the ship. As daylight strengthened, activity spread naturally throughout the vessel according to the practical demands of maritime travel. Crew members checked sail conditions, secured loose equipment, and inspected sections of rigging strained by changing weather during the night. One sailor repaired worn rope near the rail, while another cleaned seawater from the deck using stiff brushes and buckets lowered into the ocean below. Sarah Briggs prepared simple meals within the confined warmth of the galley area, while her daughter watched quietly from nearby corners of the cabin. Captain Briggs reviewed charts and cargo records between conversations with crewmen regarding navigation and sea conditions ahead. The Brigantine itself responded constantly to these overlapping actions, floors shifting beneath moving footsteps, lanterns swinging with each larger swell, doors opening briefly before wind forced them shut again against the cold Atlantic air. Life inside the moving wooden world of the Mary Celeste encouraged a particular awareness of repetition and passing time. Days rarely announced themselves through dramatic change. Instead, life advanced through cycles of work, meals, weather observation, and shifting light across the sea. Yet these repeated patterns carried emotional meaning for those aboard. Familiar sounds brought reassurance during rough weather. Routine labor offered structure within the uncertainty of Atlantic travel. Even ordinary gestures, handing someone warm coffee, adjusting a lantern before nightfall, gained quiet significance inside the isolated environment of the brigantine. Surrounded endlessly by water and sky, the people aboard depended deeply upon shared habit and practical cooperation, creating small forms of stability within a world shaped constantly by motion, weather, and distance from land. Afternoons aboard the Mary Celeste carried a slower rhythm shaped by long stretches of open sea and the steady repetition of maritime labor. Sunlight occasionally broke through the Atlantic cloud cover and spread across sections of damp deck, warming the dark wood for brief periods before drifting fog or new weather returned. Sailors moved through familiar routines with practiced efficiency developed over many voyages. Some repaired torn sections of sailcloth while seated beside coils of rope near the mast. Others checked barrels below deck or inspected areas where seawater entered through narrow seams in the aging hull. The brigantine traveled onward beneath shifting skies that changed gradually throughout the day, carrying everyone farther from shore and deeper into the quiet, unbroken isolation of the Atlantic crossing. The sensory atmosphere during these middle hours often felt different from the colder sharpness of morning or the enclosed darkness of night. Sea air carried softer warmth whenever sunlight reached the deck, blending with the smell of canvas drying briefly after rain or mist. The sound of waves changed according to weather and speed. During calmer periods, water brushed gently against the hull with low rhythmic motion that echoed through the ship's frame like distant, steady breathing. Meals prepared during the afternoon released comforting scents of soup, bread, and cooked grain into narrow passageways where sailors passed carrying tools or lanterns. Clothing dried more easily during these brighter hours, though traces of salt and dampness remained woven deeply into fabric, rope, blankets, and nearly every surface touched by the Atlantic environment surrounding the vessel. Subtle changes unfolded constantly aboard the brigantine, even when days appeared outwardly ordinary. Weather conditions shifted without warning across the open sea, requiring quick adjustments to sail position and navigation. Clouds gathered heavily 1 hour before breaking apart into pale sunlight the next. Captain Briggs watched these developments carefully from the quarterdeck, balancing caution with the practical need to maintain steady progress across the Atlantic. Below deck, Sarah reorganized belongings unsettled by rough movement during previous nights at sea, while her daughter adapted increasingly to shipboard life, learning where she could safely walk during stronger swells. Crew members also changed gradually through repetition and fatigue. Beards thickened, hands roughened further from rope work and cold weather. Conversations shortened during difficult conditions and relaxed again during calmer stretches of water and clearer sky. Within the confined world of the Mary Celeste, emotional life often moved quietly beneath ordinary routine rather than through dramatic expression. Sailors carried private thoughts while continuing practical labor among sails and rigging. Some likely reflected on distant homes or families waiting beyond the Atlantic horizon. Others focused more narrowly on weather, navigation, and the physical demands of daily work aboard the brigantine. For the Briggs family, shared routines within the cabin created moments of closeness difficult to separate from the movement of the ship itself. Reading beside lantern light, preparing meals, or listening together to wind and waves became part of the emotional structure of life at sea. Beyond the wooden walls surrounding them, the Atlantic continued rolling endlessly outward beneath changing skies, carrying the vessel deeper into uncertain distance. Evening aboard the Mary Celeste arrived through gradual dimming rather than sudden darkness. The Atlantic sky softened into layers of gray-blue cloud, while the final traces of daylight reflected weakly across the restless water surrounding the brigantine. Sailors completed their remaining tasks before night watch began, securing ropes and checking sails against colder winds arriving from the open sea. Dampness gathered more heavily along the deck as temperature dropped after sunset. Lanterns were lit one by one throughout the vessel, their small flames swaying gently with the motion beneath the hull. From a distance, the ship might have appeared like a quiet, floating glow surrounded entirely by darkening Atlantic water. Inside that moving wooden structure, every room carried signs of continued human life shaped by routine and repetition. The sensory atmosphere during evening hours felt more enclosed than at any other time of day. Warmth from the galley spread slowly through nearby passageways while the scent of cooked stew, tea, lamp oil, and drying wool settled into the timber walls. Outside the cabin windows, waves struck the brigantine with deeper force as nighttime winds strengthened over the sea. Sailors returning below deck after long hours outside carried traces of salt water and cold air into the warmer interior spaces. The ship responded audibly to changing conditions around it, ceiling beams creaking overhead, glass lantern covers rattling softly against their metal frames, water slipping against the hull in slow rhythmic patterns beneath the sleeping quarters. Even small sounds gained greater presence after dark, when conversation quieted and the Atlantic night surrounded the vessel completely. Throughout these evening hours, life aboard continued through familiar patterns shaped by duty and limited space. Crewmen gathered briefly for meals before separating again according to watch schedules and assigned responsibilities. Some repaired clothing or sharpened tools beneath lantern light, while others rested quietly in narrow bunks rocked gently by the sea. Captain Briggs reviewed navigation records and weather observations with disciplined attention before speaking softly with Sarah inside the family cabin. Their daughter gradually adapted to sleeping through the movement and sound surrounding the brigantine each night. Above deck, sailors rotated through watches beneath shifting clouds and occasional stars visible between drifting mist. Wind direction changed subtly after midnight, requiring another adjustment to the sails as the brigantine pressed onward through colder Atlantic waters carrying cargo, crew, and quiet domestic routine together through darkness. Within the emotional atmosphere of the ship, nighttime often encouraged reflection more naturally than daytime labor allowed. The confined wooden world of the brigantine felt especially isolated after sunset when no land, harbor lights, or passing vessels interrupted the endless darkness surrounding the Atlantic crossing. Some sailors may have found comfort in routine work and familiar sounds repeated night after night. Others likely experienced moments of loneliness while standing watch beneath cold wind and distant stars. For the Briggs family, the cabin became a small refuge of warmth and closeness protected temporarily against the immense sea outside. Shared conversation, prayer, or simple silence beside lantern light carried quiet emotional weight within such surroundings. Beyond the wooden walls, the Atlantic continued moving beneath the ship with patient force, guiding the Mary Celeste farther into the unknown distance ahead. During rougher stretches of weather, the entire atmosphere aboard the Mary Celeste shifted into a more demanding rhythm shaped by movement, caution, and physical endurance. Strong Atlantic winds pressed heavily against the sails and caused the brigantine to lean sharply across uneven swells. Water traveled across the deck in cold, rushing sheets before slipping back into the sea through narrow openings near the rail. Sailors moved carefully between ropes and cargo equipment while holding tightly to railings slick with rain and salt. Below deck, lanterns swung in wider arcs that sent shadows sliding across walls, tables, and sleeping bunks. Barrels groaned softly against their restraints while loose objects clicked together inside storage compartments whenever larger waves lifted the vessel abruptly against the dark water surrounding it. The sensory experience during these periods became deeply physical for everyone aboard. Damp air entered clothing so completely that even blankets and coats felt heavy with moisture after several difficult days at sea. Meals carried stronger emotional comfort during rough weather because warmth itself became precious inside the cold moving ship. The smell of hot soup, coffee, and bread drifting upward from the galley mixed with seawater, lamp smoke, and wet timber carried through every passageway. Sleep arrived unevenly beneath constant motion as waves struck the hull with unpredictable force throughout the night. Above deck, sailors heard wind rushing through the rigging with long, hollow tones that sometimes drowned ordinary conversation entirely. Even footsteps changed during storms, becoming slower and more deliberate as everyone adjusted instinctively to the dangerous movement beneath the brigantine. These difficult conditions required continuous practical adjustments from crew and family alike. Captain Briggs spent longer hours above deck studying weather patterns and directing sail changes intended to protect both ship and cargo from unnecessary strain. Sailors worked in teams securing loose rigging, reinforcing weakened lines, and checking for seawater entering the hull below deck. Sarah adapted domestic routines around the harsher motion of the vessel, storing breakable objects more carefully and helping her daughter remain calm during sudden rolling movements that shook the cabin walls and floor. Ordinary tasks demanded greater concentration under such circumstances. Carrying lanterns through passageways became hazardous. Writing letters or notes proved difficult when the table shifted constantly beneath one's hands. Yet the brigantine continued responding to these efforts with stubborn endurance, shaped by years of Atlantic crossings and practiced maritime discipline. Within the emotional life of the ship, rough weather often revealed quiet forms of dependence between those aboard. Sailors relied upon one another's skill and steadiness while handling dangerous work beneath rain, wind, and darkness. Small gestures gained unusual importance during exhausting conditions. Someone offering dry gloves after a freezing watch, a warm drink passed silently between tired crewmen, Sarah comforting her daughter while waves battered the outer hull through the night. The brigantine became not only a vessel crossing the Atlantic, but also a fragile shared shelter carrying human routine through forces far larger than itself. Beyond the lantern light and wooden walls surrounding the passengers, the sea moved endlessly beneath the storm clouds, vast and indifferent to the small, moving world struggling onward across its surface. As the voyage continued through late autumn waters, the Mary Celeste settled fully into the repetitive rhythm shared by many 19th century merchant vessels crossing the Atlantic. Days flowed into one another through patterns of labor, weather observation, meals, and interrupted sleep shaped by the movement of the sea. The brigantine carried visible signs of constant use across every section of its wooden structure. Deck planks darkened beneath seawater and heavy boots. Ropes stiffened gradually with salt and cold air. Lantern smoke gathered faintly along cabin ceilings already stained by years of maritime life. Yet the ship continued forward with practical reliability, rising and falling against long Atlantic swells while clouds shifted endlessly overhead. Inside that enclosed wooden world, human routine persisted quietly against the vast surrounding distance of sea and sky. Physical existence aboard the brigantine demanded continuous awareness of the environment. Sailors felt weather changes through subtle shifts in wind temperature and pressure before storms fully arrived upon the horizon. Meals were eaten quickly during rough conditions, while dishes slid slightly across tables, responding to uneven motion beneath the hull. The smell of damp canvas, lamp oil, seawater, and preserved food settled deeply into clothing and bedding until every personal belonging carried traces of Atlantic travel. During calmer evenings, lantern light reflected warmly against polished sections of wood worn smooth by years of human contact. At night, waves struck the hull below sleeping quarters with slow rhythmic force that became part of ordinary consciousness aboard the ship. The sea entered every aspect of life physically, shaping sensation, movement, and thought within the confined, floating world of the Mary Celeste. Small developments continued unfolding gradually even during outwardly ordinary days. Sailors rotated through watches while fatigue and familiarity altered conversations, gestures, and moods aboard the brigantine. Captain Briggs balanced practical authority with steady attention toward crew, cargo, and family as the Atlantic crossing progressed farther from American waters. Sarah maintained domestic order within limited space by washing clothing, securing belongings, and preserving routines that brought emotional stability into the unpredictable maritime environment. Their daughter adapted further to the sounds and motion surrounding her, growing comfortable with lanterns swaying overhead and footsteps crossing the deck late into the night. The brigantine itself responded constantly to weather and human activity, sails tightening beneath stronger gusts, timber expanding and groaning after rain, water shifting quietly below deck beside the cargo hold during rougher seas. For those aboard, life inside the moving wooden world likely felt ordinary in ways later generations would struggle to imagine. No one living through those days could sense how history would eventually surround the Mary Celeste with speculation and unease. At that moment, the brigantine remained simply a working vessel carrying cargo and people through the familiar hardships of Atlantic travel. Sailors focused upon navigation, weather, and daily labor. The Briggs family concentrated upon shared routine and the practical realities of life at sea. Around them stretched only water, wind, and the long, uncertain passage toward distant shores hidden somewhere beyond the horizon. The Atlantic continued carrying the vessel onward beneath changing skies, while human life persisted quietly within the wooden walls of the ship, surrounded completely by movement, isolation, and the endless breathing rhythm of the open sea. They survived the wind. They endured the rain. But something silent was waiting for them in the mid-Atlantic. A cold gray morning was coming, a morning when another ship would find them. Empty. The Atlantic morning appeared pale and uncertain when the crew of the Dei Grazia first noticed the distant brigantine drifting across the open water ahead. Thin winter sunlight spread weakly through layers of cloud and mist while long swells lifted both vessels with slow, uneven motion beneath the gray sky. At first, the unidentified ship appeared almost unfinished against the horizon, its sails hanging awkwardly as though shaped incorrectly by the wind. As the Dei Grazia moved nearer, details gradually sharpened through the damp Atlantic haze. The brigantine leaned slightly against the current with loose rigging swaying above dark-weathered decks. No figures crossed the rail. No signal flags moved overhead. Only the empty vessel traveled silently through the cold November sea. The atmosphere aboard the Dei Grazia carried an uneasy mixture of ordinary maritime sound and growing uncertainty. Sailors heard ropes creaking against damp timber while seawater struck the hull below in slow rhythmic patterns. The air smelled strongly of salt, wet canvas, coal smoke from the galley, and cold wind moving steadily across the Atlantic surface. Some crewmen narrowed their eyes toward the drifting brigantine, while others paused briefly during routine work to watch the silent vessel more carefully. Distant gulls circled low over the water before disappearing into the mist behind both ships. Somewhere overhead, loose sailcloth snapped sharply against the wind aboard the abandoned brigantine. The sound traveled clearly across the sea and then faded again into the heavy quiet surrounding the drifting ship. As the day Grazia approached closer, practical concerns slowly replaced simple curiosity among the crew. The brigantine failed to answer signals sent across the water, and its strange movement suggested a ship traveling without guidance or proper control. Captain Morehouse studied the vessel carefully through his telescope, while sailors adjusted course to bring the two ships alongside one another. A boarding party prepared quietly near the rail, gathering ropes and equipment before lowering a small boat into the restless Atlantic water between the vessels. The men crossed cautiously through rising swells while the drifting brigantine towered larger above them with every stroke of the oars. From below, they could see weather-stained planks, tangled rigging, and a rope ladder hanging loosely against the hull moving gently with the motion of the sea. For the sailors approaching the mysterious brigantine, the moment likely carried a difficult emotional balance between discipline and instinctive unease. Experienced mariners understood how quickly storms, accidents, or illness could alter life aboard a ship far from land. Yet something about the drifting vessel unsettled them in quieter ways harder to explain through practical reasoning alone. Ships belong to human movement and sound. Footsteps across deck planks, voices exchanged during labor, lanterns glowing behind cabin windows after dark. Here, the brigantine floated with the strange emptiness of ordinary life interrupted suddenly and left unfinished. Around both vessels, the Atlantic rolled endlessly beneath the pale morning sky, while the boarding party climbed slowly toward the silent deck waiting above the water. The boarding party climbed carefully onto the drifting brigantine while the Atlantic swelled heavily beneath the hull. Wet ropes brushed against their coats as they stepped across the abandoned deck, where seawater collected in shallow pools between dark wooden planks. The ship carried visible signs of recent travel rather than destruction. Sails remained partly raised overhead, though several lines hung loose and untended beside the rigging. Near the rail, equipment rested where sailors might normally leave it during ordinary labor at sea. A hat lay trapped beside a coil of rope dampened by mist and spray. The wheel stood unattended beneath the pale sky, while the brigantine drifted quietly through the cold Atlantic current, moving without visible direction or human guidance. The sensory atmosphere aboard the vessel felt strangely intimate because ordinary traces of life remained everywhere despite the complete absence of people. The air inside the passageways breathed of lamp oil, seawater, damp timber, and faint remnants of cooked food lingering below deck. Water tapped softly against the hull beneath the cabins while doors creaked unevenly within their frames each time the brigantine rolled across a swell. The sailors heard their own footsteps too clearly against the wooden floors as they moved through narrow corridors lit only by weak daylight entering through salt-stained windows. Somewhere overhead, loose rigging struck the mast in irregular rhythm shaped by shifting wind. The ship sounded alive in small ways, yet every human voice that should have answered those sounds had vanished into silence. As the men explored farther below deck, details of interrupted daily life appeared gradually from room to room. A lantern remained secured beside the cabin wall, though its flame had long since died. Clothing hung neatly near sleeping quarters where blankets still carried the shape of recent use. In the galley, dishes rested upon the table beside utensils arranged as though a meal had ended only moments earlier. One chair leaned slightly against the wall from the movement of the sea, while another remained pulled outward from the table in unfinished position. Captain Morehouse's men checked storage areas, navigation equipment, and the cargo hold with increasing confusion. The brigantine had suffered no catastrophic damage. Provisions remained aboard. Personal belongings had not been gathered for departure. Yet every section of the vessel confirmed the same unsettling truth. No one remained aboard the Mary Celeste. For the sailors searching through the empty brigantine, the emotional weight of the discovery deepened quietly rather than dramatically. Human absence became more disturbing precisely because the surroundings appeared so ordinary. The untouched meal, the folded clothing, the familiar arrangement of tools and household objects all suggested routines interrupted without warning or explanation. Some of the men likely imagined voices filling these cabins only days earlier, a child moving between the narrow rooms, sailors speaking during meals beneath lantern light, Captain Briggs studying charts beside the cabin desk while waves rolled beneath the hull outside. Now the brigantine carried only echoes of those ordinary moments preserved within silence. Beyond the wooden walls surrounding them, the Atlantic continued shifting endlessly beneath gray winter sky as the empty ship drifted alone across the open sea. The deeper the boarding party searched the Mary Celeste, the more the vessel seemed suspended between ordinary life and unexplained abandonment. The cabins remained orderly despite the Atlantic weather surrounding the brigantine. Water had entered certain sections below deck, leaving damp marks along wooden walls and floors, yet nothing suggested violent struggle or sudden destruction. Captain Briggs's navigation instruments rested near the chart table where papers still lay scattered beneath weak daylight, filtering through the cabin windows. A sewing needle remained threaded beside folded fabric near Sarah's belongings. In another corner, a small child's shoe rested partially beneath the bed frame beside a toy left against the wall. The ship appeared physically inhabited by traces of recent human presence, even while every living occupant had disappeared completely from sight. The sensory atmosphere below deck carried a strange quietness shaped not by emptiness alone, but by interrupted familiarity. The boarding party smelled damp wool, salt air, candle wax, and faint traces of food that had spoiled slowly during the brigantine's drifting passage across the Atlantic. Each movement through the narrow corridors produced soft echoes against timber walls darkened by moisture and age. Lantern hooks tapped lightly against beams overhead, while seawater shifted rhythmically below the hull with slow, hollow sounds. One sailor brushed his hand across the galley table and felt crumbs still scattered near cold utensils left behind after the unfinished meal. Another opened a storage chest and found neatly folded clothing untouched by theft or panic. The ship surrounded the men with ordinary domestic sensations that only deepened the unsettling absence of voices, footsteps, and human routine. As the search continued, small discoveries gradually shaped possible explanations among the boarding crew. The ship's longboat was missing from its usual position, and certain navigation records no longer remained aboard. A sounding rod used to measure water within the hull appeared recently handled beside damp sections below deck, where limited flooding had occurred. Captain Morehouse's men examined these details carefully while moving between cargo barrels, cabins, and storage compartments affected unevenly by seawater. Some sailors wondered whether Captain Briggs had feared the brigantine might sink after misjudging the amount of water entering the vessel. Others studied the damaged rigging and frayed ropes, suggesting rough weather during previous days at sea. Yet no single explanation settled comfortably over the strange collection of evidence scattered quietly throughout the drifting ship. For the men aboard the Dei Grazia, The emotional atmosphere surrounding the Mary Celeste likely changed from curiosity towards something more reflective and deeply human. The brigantine no longer resembled merely an abandoned vessel encountered by chance upon the Atlantic. It felt instead like a preserved fragment of interrupted life slowly drifting through open water beneath indifferent skies. Every personal belonging left behind reminded the sailors that real people had occupied these rooms not long before the discovery. Meals had been prepared, clothing folded, charts studied, prayers perhaps spoken quietly during rough weather at sea. The empty brigantine carried all the physical signs of ordinary existence while withholding the final moment that separated its passengers from the ship itself. Around both vessels, gray Atlantic swells continued rolling patiently beneath the winter light as unanswered silence settled over the drifting Mary Celeste. As daylight weakened across the Atlantic, the boarding party continued moving through the Mary Celeste with slower and more deliberate attention. The brigantine drifted heavily upon the evening swells while pale light faded along the wet deck and tangled rigging overhead. Sections of sail hung unevenly against the masts where shifting wind pressed softly through loose canvas. Water collected near the scuppers and reflected the gray sky in trembling patches broken by footsteps and movement aboard the ship. The Atlantic surrounding the vessel appeared immense during these hours before nightfall, stretching outward beneath thick cloud and cold mist that gradually blurred the horizon. Between the two ships, small boats crossed carefully through darkening water carrying reports, supplies, and quiet conversation back toward the waiting crew of the Dei Grazia. The sensory atmosphere aboard the brigantine deepened as evening settled over the sea. Damp air entered every cabin and passageway carrying the smell of salt water, aging timber, spoiled food, and lamp oil soaked deeply into wooden walls over many voyages. Lanterns lit by the boarding crew cast moving shadows across tables, bunks, and storage chests while the ship rolled steadily beneath them. Somewhere below deck, loose cargo shifted faintly against surrounding barrels whenever larger swells lifted the hull unevenly through the Atlantic current. Above deck, ropes struck the mast in irregular rhythm while wind moved through the sails with long whispering sounds that resembled distant breathing. Even ordinary objects appeared strangely intimate beneath lantern light. A comb beside the wash basin, folded blankets resting near the cabin wall, a child's cup secured carefully upon a shelf to prevent falling during rough weather. As the hours passed, the men aboard the Mary Celeste began organizing practical efforts to guide the brigantine safely toward port. Sailors from the Dei Grazia adjusted damaged rigging, inspected sails, and secured equipment left unattended during the vessel's drifting isolation at sea. Captain Morehouse reviewed charts and conditions carefully while discussing salvage arrangements with trusted crewmen near the quarterdeck. Below deck, others continued documenting what remained aboard the abandoned brigantine. Cargo barrels filled with industrial alcohol stood largely untouched within the hold despite moisture and rough movement during previous storms. Personal belongings remained scattered naturally throughout the cabins rather than packed hurriedly for escape. These details complicated every theory forming among the sailors. The ship suggested sudden departure without revealing fear, violence, or any clear sequence of events leading toward the missing lifeboat and vanished passengers. For the men keeping watch aboard the drifting brigantine that evening, emotional unease likely settled gradually through repeated exposure to the preserved signs of absent life surrounding them. The Mary Celeste carried not the atmosphere of disaster, but something quieter and more difficult to explain. Ordinary domestic order remained suspended inside the vessel as though time itself had paused between one human moment and the next. Some sailors may have imagined Captain Briggs standing near the navigation table only days earlier while Sarah cared for their daughter below deck beside the gentle movement of the sea. Others perhaps avoided such thoughts entirely while focusing upon ropes, sails, and practical labor beneath the cold Atlantic sky. Yet silence filled every cabin once the lantern light faded into shadow, and beyond the wooden walls surrounding the ship, the endless ocean rolled onward beneath gathering night. Night spread slowly across the Atlantic until both the Dei Grazia and the drifting Mary Celeste floated beneath a sky almost entirely consumed by darkness and cloud. Lanterns hanging aboard the abandoned brigantine glowed softly against wet timber and swaying rigging while the sea rolled beneath both vessels with deep, uneven motion shaped by distant weather beyond the horizon. Cold wind traveled constantly across the open water carrying fine mist that gathered along coats, ropes, and railings. The empty ship appeared strangely alive during these nighttime hours. Sails shifted faintly overhead. Water struck the hull with hollow force below deck. Loose fittings tapped softly within the darkness. From a distance, the brigantine seemed like an ordinary vessel continuing its Atlantic crossing, though no original crew remained to guide its course through the black water. The sensory atmosphere aboard the Mary Celeste became even more intimate after dark because lantern light revealed only fragments of the silent ship at one time. Narrow passageways emerged briefly from shadow before disappearing again behind moving pools of yellow light. The smell of damp canvas, spoiled provisions, lamp smoke, and seawater settled heavily inside the cabins where fresh Atlantic air entered through cracked doors and loosened seams along the walls. Sailors keeping watch heard subtle sounds from every section of the brigantine. A hanging spoon striking gently against metal during stronger swells, a loose shutter shifting against the window frame, water slipping through the hull into lower compartments with soft repetitive rhythm. These ordinary noises gained unsettling presence precisely because they continued without human conversation, laughter, or movement to accompany them within the abandoned wooden world. Throughout the night, practical work continued carefully aboard the drifting brigantine. Sailors from the Dei Grazia rotated watches while others attempted temporary repairs needed to keep the vessel stable during the remaining Atlantic crossing toward port. Lantern-carrying crewmen moved between cabins, storage areas, and the deck inspecting equipment affected by weather and neglect. Some studied the captain's documents again, searching for overlooked clues hidden among navigation notes, cargo records, and scattered papers left behind in the cabin. Others examined damaged rigging and water levels below deck while discussing possibilities quietly between themselves. Yet every new observation seemed only to deepen uncertainty rather than resolve it. The missing lifeboat suggested deliberate departure, but the untouched belongings aboard the Mary Celeste continued resisting simple explanation. The brigantine carried evidence of sudden absence without preserving the moment that caused it. For those who spent long hours aboard the abandoned ship, the emotional atmosphere likely became difficult to separate from imagination itself. Night at sea already encouraged reflection and unease among experienced mariners, especially when surrounded by darkness stretching endlessly beyond lantern light and rigging. Inside the silent Mary Celeste, ordinary objects encouraged thoughts about interrupted lives and vanished routines. Someone had folded those blankets. Someone had prepared that unfinished meal. A child had once slept beside the small belongings remaining quietly within the cabin. The brigantine preserved traces of human warmth while offering only silence in return. Beyond the deck rail, Atlantic waves rolled endlessly beneath drifting cloud and faint winter stars as the abandoned vessel traveled onward through darkness beside the watchful crew of the Dei Grazia. By the following morning, the Atlantic appeared calmer, though the strange emotional weight surrounding the Mary Celeste had not faded from the minds of those aboard. Pale winter lights spread slowly across the sea and revealed the brigantine traveling beside the Dei Grazia under careful supervision from the salvage crew. Damp sails hung against a sky layered with thin gray cloud, while seawater slipped quietly from sections of deck still soaked by previous weather. The abandoned ship moved with the familiar physical behavior of any working vessel crossing the Atlantic. Timber creaking beneath pressure from the swells, ropes straining gently against the masts, water shifting below deck beside cargo barrels and storage compartments. Yet every ordinary sound carried deeper significance now, because the original voices and routines belonging to the brigantine had vanished completely from the moving wooden world. The sensory atmosphere aboard the ship remained filled with traces of interrupted human life preserved by the cold Atlantic air. Sailors opening cabin doors encountered lingering smells of tea leaves, damp clothing, lamp smoke, and seawater absorbed deeply into the timber walls. Morning light entered through salt-stained windows and illuminated familiar objects left exactly where the missing passengers had once used them. A brush near the wash basin, folded garments resting inside storage chests, utensils arranged beside cold plates in the galley. The brigantine carried not the chaos of disaster, but the uneasy stillness of ordinary existence suddenly emptied of people. Even the sea seemed quieter around the vessel during those early hours, though waves continued rolling steadily beneath the hull with slow rhythmic force shaped by the Atlantic current and distant weather beyond the horizon. As preparations continued to bring the Mary Celeste safely toward port, the sailors of the Dei Grazia settled into practical routines aboard the abandoned vessel. Some repaired damaged rigging, while others managed navigation under Captain Morehouse's direction across the open Atlantic. Men moved carefully through familiar maritime tasks, even while surrounded by unanswered questions lingering within every section of the ship. Below deck, inspections continued among the cargo barrels and cabins where evidence remained frustratingly incomplete. The missing lifeboat, damaged equipment, and traces of water within the hull suggested fear or uncertainty during the final hours aboard the brigantine. Yet valuable possessions remained untouched. Food and supplies had not been abandoned in panic. The Mary Celeste resisted clear interpretation at every turn, offering fragments of possibility rather than certainty about the vanished crew and family once living within its wooden walls. For those who encountered the drifting brigantine during those cold Atlantic days, the experience likely remained memorable not because of violence or visible catastrophe, but because of absence itself. Human beings leave emotional traces within ordinary spaces through repeated habit and shared routine. The Mary Celeste carried those traces everywhere, in the carefully arranged cabin belongings, in the unfinished meal resting quietly below deck, in the child's possessions remaining untouched beside the bunk. The brigantine seemed suspended between presence and disappearance, preserving physical evidence of life while withholding its final chapter completely. Long after the ship eventually reached port and newspapers transformed the event into mystery and speculation, the Atlantic itself continued unchanged beneath shifting skies and winter fog. Somewhere within that vast ocean silence, the unanswered story of the Mary Celeste drifted onward like the abandoned vessel once carried across the cold gray sea. No signs of panic. The cargo of industrial alcohol was perfectly sealed. 900 barrels of dangerous chemicals untouched. Yet, the sounding rod lay on the wet deck, and the clock was upside down. Did they flee from an invisible explosion? Or did something alter the captain's mind, turning this floating home into a living nightmare? The final logs are found. The ultimate truth is waiting to be uncovered, releasing in just 48 hours.